What does it mean when a country demands gratitude from nations it once exploited? Africa is now confident and no longer willing to play by the rules of its former colonizers. Across the continent, nations are standing up to France, rejecting old ties, and demanding new respect. But just as Africa steps into power, French President Emmanuel Macron accuses these nations of being ungrateful. And after Burkina Faso's leader, every other African leader is asking, ungrateful for what? And Macron has no answer. But why did he even pass a statement like this? And what reaction has it brought? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. French President Emmanuel Macron is no stranger to controversy, but his recent comments about Africa have sparked an uproar like never before. In a speech that felt more like a reprimand than a diplomatic address, Macron accused African nations of being ungrateful for the support France has provided over the years. His frustration was palpable as he detailed France's efforts to help stabilize the Sahel region, combat insurgency, and provide military assistance. Yet, instead of being praised for these efforts, Macron lamented that France has faced increasing criticism and pushback from African leaders and citizens. But let's slow down and unpack what Macron said. The term ungrateful wasn't just a throwaway remark, it was loaded with implications. Macron argued that France had made significant sacrifices for Africa, including deploying thousands of troops, spending billions of euros, and losing French lives in the process. His underlying message was clear. France has gone out of its way to help Africa, and the least African nations could do was show some gratitude. On the surface, Macron's comments might seem like the words of a frustrated ally who feels underappreciated. After all, France has been deeply involved in the fight against insurgency in Africa, particularly in the Sahel, a region that includes countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Insurgent groups have wreaked havoc in the region, destabilizing governments, displacing millions, and creating a humanitarian crisis. France's military operations, such as Operation Barkhane, were launched to combat these threats, and Macron emphasized the significant cost of these efforts. So, what's the problem? Why did Macron's comments spark such outrage? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. To answer that, we need to look beyond the surface. For many Africans, Macron's words weren't just frustrating, they were insulting. The term ungrateful struck a particularly sour note because it carried echoes of colonial arrogance. It suggested that Africa should be eternally thankful for France's involvement, regardless of whether that involvement was truly beneficial to African nations. It was a stark reminder of the power dynamics that have defined France-Africa relations for decades, a dynamic where France often positions itself as a benefactor and Africa as a recipient of its goodwill. The timing of Macron's comments only made things worse. They came at a moment when many African nations were actively pushing back against France's influence. In recent years, there's been a growing movement across the continent to reclaim sovereignty, reduce dependency on former colonial powers, and build partnerships with new allies like China, Russia, and Turkey. Against this backdrop, Macron's remarks felt like an attempt to cling to a fading sense of control, a desperate bid to remind Africa of its supposed dependence on France. But Macron's words didn't just strike a nerve because of their tone. They also raised deeper questions about the nature of France's involvement in Africa. Is France helping, or is it acting in its self-interest? Is this about counterinsurgency, or is it about protecting French economic and geopolitical interests? These are the questions that many Africans are now asking. To understand the outrage, we also need to consider the historical context. France's colonial past looms large over its relationship with Africa. For decades, France exploited African nations for their resources, labor, and strategic value. From the extraction of raw materials like gold and uranium to the imposition of the CFA franc, a currency controlled by France but used by 14 African countries. France's involvement in Africa has often been more about what it can gain than what it can give. This history makes Macron's demand for gratitude feel particularly galling. It's as if the teacher who spent years holding you back suddenly demands a thank you for occasionally pointing you in the right direction. And then there's the issue of how Macron framed France's military presence. By emphasizing France's sacrifices, Macron glossed over the fact that these operations haven't always been welcomed by African nations. While France claims to be combating insurgency, many Africans see its military presence as a continuation of colonial control. There's a growing perception that France is more interested in securing access to resources and maintaining geopolitical influence than in genuinely helping African nations address their challenges. Take Niger, for example. The country is a key partner in France's counterinsurgency efforts, and it's also home to some of the largest uranium deposits in the world. This uranium is critical to France's nuclear energy industry, which supplies much of the country's electricity. For many Africans, it's hard to ignore the connection between France's military presence in Niger and its reliance on Niger's resources. This duality, presenting itself as a helper while pursuing its interests, has fueled skepticism about France's motives. Macron's remarks also ignored the sacrifices Africans have made for France. During both world wars, hundreds of thousands of African soldiers fought and died for France, often in brutal conditions and with little recognition. These men, known as tirailleurs Senegalais, left their homes and families to defend a country that didn't treat them as equals. Their contributions were immense, yet their stories are often erased from history. For Macron to demand gratitude from Africa without acknowledging this history is, at best, tone-deaf and, at worst, deeply disrespectful. The fallout from Macron's comments has been significant. Across Africa, leaders and citizens alike have condemned his remarks, calling them arrogant, insulting, and reflective of a deeper problem in France's relationship with the continent. Many nations have reacted, and on top was Burkina Faso. We have already made a video on Traoré's bold reaction. But after him, France thought the storm would calm down, but they never expected the reaction that was to come from nations like Chad and Senegal. Starting with Chad. Chadian President Mohamed Idriss Déby didn't hold back in his response. On January 7th, Déby publicly rebuked Macron, stating that his comments dishonored and disrespected Africa. He accused Macron of failing to understand the modern reality of African sovereignty, claiming that the French president's mindset was stuck in an era when colonial powers dictated terms to African nations. Déby's words struck a chord not just in Chad, but across the continent, where Macron's remarks were widely viewed as arrogant and dismissive. The fallout from Macron's comments wasn't limited to diplomatic rebukes. Chad's government took decisive action by reiterating its order for French troops to withdraw from the country by the end of January 2025. This wasn't an empty threat. Several hundred French troops had already departed Chad in December 2024, and the handover of a French military base in Faya-Largeau, northern Chad, signaled the seriousness of Chad's stance. The withdrawal of French troops from Chad is significant. For decades, France's military presence in the country was seen as a cornerstone of its Sahel strategy, providing a base for operations against insurgent groups. But for Chadian leaders, Macron's remarks underscored the imbalance in their relationship with France. They argued that France's military efforts were driven more by its strategic interests than by a genuine desire to help Chad or the region. Chadian Prime Minister Alamai Halina chaired a special commission to oversee the troop withdrawal. During the meeting, Halina described Macron's comments as an insult to the African soldiers who fought for France during World War II. He reminded the world that over 200,000 soldiers were conscripted from French colonies, including Chad, to help France battle Nazi Germany. For many in Chad, Macron's demand for gratitude felt like a cruel irony, given Africa's historic sacrifices for France. Chad's leaders weren't the only ones outraged by Macron's comments. The remarks sparked protests in the capital, N'Djamena, where hundreds of young people gathered to voice their dissatisfaction. Many of the protesters carried banners calling for the complete removal of French troops and denouncing what they described as France's exploitative presence in Africa. These protests weren't just about Macron's comments. They reflected a broader frustration with France's ongoing influence in Chad and across Africa. Many Chadians see France's military presence as a means of securing access to resources like oil, gold, and uranium, rather than a genuine effort to promote stability. This sentiment is part of a growing wave of anti-French sentiment across the continent, driven by decades of exploitation and interference.
Anti-France sentiment started spreading to other countries hosting French troops like Chad, Senegal, and most recently the Ivory Coast. This is a massive failure for France, a moment of shame. But Macron does not see it that way. He says Paris is not on the back foot. Instead, he blames the African nations. Macron called them, and I'm quoting, ungrateful. And then he said, and let me quote again, none of them would be in a sovereign country today if the French army had not been deployed in this region. This is the French president, the leader of a former colonial power, talking about countries that won their independence from France. Macron says the French army is responsible for their sovereignty. How tone-deaf can you be? If anything, the African countries would have been sovereign sooner if not for the French army. Macron's mental gymnastics are truly world-class, but obviously the African nations were not impressed.
Chad's reaction to Macron's remarks is emblematic of a broader shift in Africa's relationship with France. Under President Déby's leadership, Chad has become increasingly assertive in asserting its sovereignty and challenging French influence. Déby's administration has made it clear that it no longer sees value in this arrangement. By demanding the withdrawal of French troops, Chad is signaling that it is ready to take control of its security and redefine its relationships with foreign powers. This move aligns with a broader trend across Africa, where countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are also pushing back against French influence. But Chad was not the only one to react. Senegal has also reacted to Macron's statement. Senegal's response to French President Emmanuel Macron's recent comments was sharp and unequivocal, led by Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko. But let us remind you, before this, Macron had claimed that the withdrawal of French troops from several African countries, including Senegal, was a result of mutual negotiations and agreements, asserting that France allowed these nations to announce the decision out of convenience and politeness. This statement did not sit well with Senegalese leadership. Prime Minister Sonko directly refuted Macron's assertion, calling it completely inaccurate. In a strong social media statement, Sonko clarified that Senegal's decision to ask French troops to leave was made unilaterally, reflecting the will of a free, independent, and sovereign nation. He emphasized that no negotiations or discussions with France had influenced Senegal's choice, making it clear that this was a decision born of national autonomy rather than a collaborative agreement with Paris. Macron's broader criticism of African nations as being ungrateful further provoked Sonko, who labeled the remarks disrespectful and historically ignorant. Sonko pointed to the sacrifices made by African soldiers, many of whom were forcibly conscripted during World War II to fight for France. If African soldiers, often mistreated and betrayed, had not been deployed during the Second World War to defend France, the country might still be German today, Sonko declared. This powerful reminder highlighted Africa's contributions to France's sovereignty and history, contributions that are rarely acknowledged by French leadership. Sonko also noted that France's military presence in Africa has often been destabilizing rather than beneficial, citing Libya as an example. He argued that France's intervention in Libya exacerbated insecurity in the Sahel region, contradicting Macron's claims of fostering stability and sovereignty on the continent. Sonko's criticism was not isolated to Macron's remarks, but extended to the broader tone of France's engagement with Africa. He called on French leaders to respect African sovereignty and acknowledge the sacrifices made by African nations in their shared history. Echoing sentiments from other African leaders, Sonko argued that France lacks the legitimacy to ensure Africa's security and sovereignty, emphasizing that African nations are capable of charting their path forward without external interference. Senegal's rebuke of Macron's comments reflects a broader shift in its foreign policy. Like Chad and other African nations, Senegal has been forging new strategic and financial partnerships with countries such as the United Arab Emirates and nations across Asia. These alliances are seen as a way to reduce dependence on France and diversify Senegal's international relationships, marking a significant realignment in the nation's geopolitical stance. So, What happens after this? What future do Africa and France have after this? The recent fallout from French President Emmanuel Macron's controversial remarks has shaken the already fragile relationship between Africa and France. One of the most significant outcomes of this controversy is Africa's accelerated push for independence from France's influence. Macron's remarks have galvanized African nations to assert their sovereignty more forcefully than ever before. Countries like Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Senegal are taking bold steps to redefine their relationships with France, including expelling French troops and dismantling military agreements. This momentum is part of a larger trend. African nations are no longer content to play junior partners in their relationships with Western powers. Instead, they are seeking to build alliances that align with their interests and priorities. Countries like China, Russia, Turkey, and the UAE are stepping in to fill the void, offering alternatives to the traditional dominance of France and other Western nations. These partnerships, while not without their complexities, allow African nations to diversify their options and reduce their dependence on any single power. For France, this shift represents a loss of influence that will be difficult to regain. The days of France unilaterally dictating terms in Africa are over. Moving forward, any engagement with African nations will require mutual respect, genuine collaboration, and a willingness to address the mistakes of the past. For France, the backlash to Macron's remarks serves as a wake-up call. If France wants to remain relevant in Africa, it must fundamentally rethink its approach. This begins with acknowledging the colonial legacy that continues to shape perceptions of its actions on the continent. Macron's comments about ingratitude only reinforce the view that France sees itself as a benefactor rather than an equal partner, a narrative that no longer resonates with African nations. France's future role in Africa will depend on its ability to adapt to new realities. This means moving away from paternalistic rhetoric and focusing on building partnerships based on mutual benefit. The backlash to Macron's remarks has also highlighted the importance of African unity in addressing common challenges. Regional organizations like the African Union (AU) are playing a larger role in shaping Africa's collective response to external pressures. Unity among African nations will be crucial in navigating the post-Macron era. By presenting a united front, African countries can strengthen their negotiating power, whether they are dealing with France, China, or any other global power. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, also have the potential to transform Africa's economic landscape, fostering greater collaboration and reducing reliance on external actors. The fallout from Macron's remarks is part of a broader shift in how Africa is perceived on the global stage. For decades, Africa was often viewed through the lens of poverty, conflict, and dependency. But the narrative is changing. Africa is now seen as a continent of opportunity, with dynamic economies, a young and innovative population, and a wealth of untapped potential. For France, this means that any attempt to rebuild its relationship with Africa must be grounded in a new understanding of the continent's aspirations and strengths. The old narratives of dependence and paternalism simply won't work anymore. So, in the end, the controversy sparked by Macron's comments is more than just a diplomatic incident. It's a turning point in the relationship between Africa and France. For Africa, it's an opportunity to assert its independence, diversify its partnerships, and build a future on its terms. For France, it's a moment of reckoning, a chance to adapt to a changing world or risk being left behind. The path forward won't be easy, but it's clear that the future belongs to Africa. As the continent rises, it's reshaping the global order and demanding a seat at the table. For France and the rest of the world, the message is clear: respect Africa or risk being part of its past, not its future. Do you think it's the time for France to value Africa? What will happen if more nations react? Let us know in the comments section. Can France and Africa have a future together? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.